Where to begin? It's as if one is trying to untangle decades of knotted thread, each strand a memory, a regret, or a searing shame. It started with William, my husband, whom I vowed to share my life with. We'd been drifting, for want of a better term. Like two ships in a fog, still visible but drifting away from each other daily. We met when I was younger. He swept me off my feet, as the cliché would have it, in retrospect. He was charming, witty, and had a laugh that made my heart skip a beat. We built a life and home, but not children. That was an unspoken sadness between us, sometimes not spoken, yet ever present. But we had our garden, didn't we? Our Sunday evening meals and quiet nights by the fire were warm, routine, and safe, perhaps too safe. And then we heard the news. William got the call and went to the doctor alone, not wishing to stress me out until he knew for certain. Brave William attempted to defend me, even when he bore the worst blows. That night, he returned home pale and weak. He placed me in the living room, the warm fire crackling, oblivious to the tempest raging in our peaceful home. He grasped my hands, which were cold and shaking. He then spoke the word, infertility. The physician was definite, no way out. The words seemed to stay suspended in midair. Infertility was not a term. It was the death of a dream we had not yet accepted, an unspoken agreement shattered without words. I just stood, my mind in a haze. This was like being in the audience of a play, not being there, just a witness to someone else's tragedy. His sparkling eyes were dulled, his face consumed by unspeakable sadness. It was not about him, was it? It was about us and our future, or rather, our lack of one. The one with kids, sticky fingers, and midnight tales, that disappeared. We hardly talked that evening. We did our evening routine, dinner, stroll in the garden, and preparing for bed. But everything was different, stilted, forced. We lay in bed, the silence oppressive. His sorrow swept over me, suffocating me in misery. I wished to console him, yet the words would not form. What could I tell him? What comfort can I offer with such devastating news? Days became weeks, and a heavy cloud hung over our home. William retreated, rising to go to work and dinner, then sitting by himself in his study with books or staring out the window. Physically there, yet emotionally elsewhere. I was adrift and alone. I spoke to him, but he brushed me off, telling me that he was fine and needed some space. But time appeared to be running out on us, and our marriage along with it. There was deafening silence at our house, broken only by the sound of the ticking grandfather clock, which reminded us of the passing time and missed chances. It was during this period of grief that I began frequenting that pub. Willow's Bend, tucked away on a dead-end road, smelled of stale beer and a hint of cinnamon. It was my sanctuary, where I could breathe outside of the stifling silence of our home. That's where I met young Garrett for the first time. So young, little more than a boy, with eyes too old for his face and a quiet smile like flickering candlelight. A bartender, he was studying something academic while working his way through university. What had drawn my attention was his attentiveness. He really heard me when I spoke, not just waiting to reply. He remembered my simple drink, a gin and tonic, after a couple of visits. Trivial, perhaps, but in my barren days, they were a lifeline. He was just being polite, of course, an experienced bartender. In my loneliness and despair, I perceived more in his silent kindness, a spark of something. Perhaps it was only a contrast to William's emotional unavailability, or something darker and more self-serving. It was a small, sinister seed of something in the dry ground of my heart. It developed in the darkness, nurtured by despair and loneliness, with a glimmer of hope that something could still blossom in my desolate life. My visits to the Willow's Bend became more frequent. Initially, it was just once a week, then twice, then almost every evening. William barely noticed, lost as he was in his own world of grief. If he did, he didn't say anything. Perhaps he was relieved to have me out of the house, to have some space, some silence to himself. Or maybe he simply didn't care anymore. That thought, that chilling possibility, was like a shard of ice piercing my heart each time it surfaced. Garrett. He was always there, behind the bar, polishing glasses, chatting with the regulars, his movements fluid and graceful despite his youth. He always greeted me with that same quiet smile, that gentle nod of recognition that made me feel seen. In a world where I felt increasingly invisible, especially to the man who was supposed to see me most clearly, Garrett's simple acknowledgement was like a warm hand on my shoulder in a cold room. We started talking more. Initially, it was just polite bar chatter, the weather, the news, the usual inconsequential things people say to fill the silence. But slowly, gradually, the conversations deepened. He asked about my day, and I, starved for connection, for someone to actually ask and genuinely listen, found myself telling him things I hadn't even realized I was holding in. About the garden, my roses that were refusing to bloom this year. A metaphor, I suppose, for my own life. About William, though I was careful not to say too much, just hinting at the distance that had grown between us. He listened patiently, his dark eyes fixed on mine, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. He didn't offer advice, didn't judge, just listened. And that, in itself, felt like a balm to my wounded soul. He told me about his studies, about his dreams of becoming an architect, I think he said. Building things, creating spaces, a stark contrast to the crumbling edifice of my own life. He spoke with a quiet passion that was captivating. It reminded me of William, years ago, full of dreams and ambition, before life, before infertility, chipped away at his spirit. There was a vibrancy in Garrett, a spark of youthful energy that was both alluring and slightly intimidating. He was a world away from my quiet, predictable life, a different universe altogether. And yet, I found myself drawn to him, to that spark, like a moth to a flame, even knowing somewhere deep down that it could burn me. One afternoon, it was a Tuesday, I remember, the bar was almost empty. Just a couple of elderly men nursing their beers in a corner booth, and me, perched on my usual stool at the bar. Garrett was wiping down the counter, humming softly to himself, a tune I didn't recognize. The afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the room, painting stripes of light and darkness on the worn wooden floor. There was a quiet intimacy in the near emptiness, a stillness that felt charged. "You seem troubled, Petunia," he said, suddenly, his voice quiet, breaking the comfortable silence. He didn't usually call me by my name. It was always madam or ma'am, a respectful distance that had somehow become familiar, comforting. Hearing my name from his lips, spoken with that gentle concern, felt different, more personal, more intimate. I hesitated, unsure how to respond, troubled. Yes, that was an understatement. Shattered, maybe. Broken. Lost. But troubled felt manageable. "It's things with my husband," I admitted finally, my voice barely a whisper. "They're complicated." He nodded slowly, his gaze steady, unwavering. "I understand," he said, though I doubted he truly could. How could he, this young man, full of life and promise, possibly understand the slow, agonizing decay of a marriage, the crushing weight of unspoken grief, the suffocating loneliness that had become my constant companion? And yet, in that moment, looking into his kind, earnest eyes, I felt understood. Or at least, I desperately wanted to feel understood. And that desperate desire, I realize now, was the beginning of the end. The moment the seed of something dangerous, something forbidden, began to truly sprout. "My garden needs help," I said, the words tumbling out before I could fully consider them. It was a clumsy, ridiculous excuse. I knew it even as I spoke. But at that moment, it felt necessary, desperate, like a drowning woman grasping at a flimsy piece of driftwood. Garrett blinked, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "Your garden, madam?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, a questioning look on his face. "Yes," I rushed on, trying to sound casual, nonchalant, even though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "It's overgrown. Weeds everywhere. And the roses, they just won't bloom. William, he hasn't been himself lately, hasn't been able to, keep up with it." Another lie, or at least a carefully constructed half-truth. William had always been the gardener in our household, but his recent withdrawal had nothing to do with the state of the garden and everything to do with the barrenness of our future. Garrett considered me for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. I don't know much about gardening, madam," he said hesitantly. "I've never really done it before." "Oh, it's not difficult," I insisted, waving my hand dismissively. "Just pulling weeds, mostly. And maybe pruning the roses. I could show you." My voice sounded too eager, too bright, even to my ears, but I couldn't stop myself. I had started down this path, this foolish, reckless path, and I couldn't turn back now. Not without knowing what lay at the end of it. He hesitated again, then a slow smile spread across his face, that gentle, hesitant smile that had begun to feel like sunshine in the gloom of my days. "Well," he said, his voice soft, "I suppose I could give it a try. I have some time off tomorrow afternoon. If you'd like the help, madam." "Petunia," I corrected him, my voice barely a whisper. "Please, call me Petunia." It felt like crossing a line, a small one perhaps, but a line nonetheless. A step closer to something dangerous. He nodded, his smile widening just a fraction. "Petunia," he repeated, the name sounding foreign and yet somehow right on his lips. "Then, Petunia, I'd be happy to help you with your garden tomorrow afternoon." The relief that washed over me was almost overwhelming. Relief and something else. A thrill, a flutter of anticipation that was both exhilarating and terrifying. I had done it. I had created an opportunity, a pretext, a chance to what? I didn't fully know, didn't allow myself to fully articulate it, even to myself. But somewhere deep down, a dark, forbidden desire was stirring, a yearning for connection, for intimacy, for something that William, in his grief and withdrawal, seemed incapable of giving me anymore. The next afternoon, he arrived at my house a little after 2. He looked different outside of the bar. Younger, somehow, bathed in the bright sunlight, his dark hair tousled by the breeze. He was wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, and he carried a small, slightly battered toolbox. He seemed nervous, hesitant. "Good," I thought. A cruel little voice whispered in my mind. Let him be nervous. Let him feel the weight of this unspoken tension, this dangerous game we were about to play. I greeted him at the door, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. I had changed my clothes 3 times that morning, finally settling on a simple linen dress, hoping it looked casual yet presentable. I felt ridiculous, and yet I couldn't stop myself. I was caught in a current, swept along by a force I couldn't control, heading towards a waterfall I knew was there, but couldn't bring myself to avoid. "Thank you for coming, Garrett," I said, my voice trembling slightly despite my best efforts to sound composed. "I really appreciate it." He smiled that gentle smile again. "It's my pleasure, Petunia," he said softly. "Lead the way to the overgrown jungle, I presume." He gestured towards the garden with a playful grin, and for a fleeting moment the tension eased, replaced by a flicker of something lighter, almost normal. But it was just a flicker, quickly extinguished by the heavy weight of unspoken intentions that hung between us, thick and suffocating, like the humid summer air. The garden indeed was a mess. Weeds had sprung up everywhere, choking the flower beds, and the roses, my beloved roses, were indeed refusing to bloom, their stems bare and thorny, their leaves wilted and brown. It was a reflection, I realized with a pang, of my inner landscape. Overgrown, neglected, barren. Garrett surveyed the scene with a slight whistle. "You weren't kidding, Petunia," he said, a playful glint in his eyes. "This is quite the challenge." "I know," I sighed, trying to sound defeated, but inside, a strange kind of excitement was bubbling up. The challenge wasn't the garden, of course. It was him. It was us. It was the dangerous game we were about to embark on amidst the overgrown roses and wilting flowers. We started with the weeds, pulling them out by hand, the sun beating down on our backs, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation. He was surprisingly adept at it, despite his earlier claims of gardening inexperience. His young hands, surprisingly strong, worked quickly and efficiently, clearing patches of weeds with focused determination. I watched him, my gaze lingering on the way his muscles flexed under his t-shirt, the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way beads of sweat glistened on his forehead in the afternoon sun. Desire, sharp and insistent, began to coil in my belly, a forbidden serpent stirring in the shadows. We worked in silence for a while, the only sounds the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, and the rhythmic tugging of weeds being uprooted from the soil. The silence was different from the oppressive silence in my house. This silence was charged, tense, pregnant with unspoken words, with unacknowledged desires, with the heavy weight of what was and what could be. "It's peaceful, isn't it?" Garrett said suddenly, breaking the silence, his voice soft, almost hesitant. He straightened up, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, and looked around the garden, his gaze taking in the overgrown flower beds, the wilting roses, and the patches of newly cleared earth. "Peaceful?" I repeated, a wry smile twisting my lips. "It's a battlefield, Garrett. A war between what we want to grow and what nature insists on throwing in our way." He considered my words for a moment, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Maybe," he said slowly, "or maybe it's just life, a mix of beauty and struggle, growth and decay." His words resonated with me, deeper than he could know. Growth and decay. That was it, wasn't it? That was my life, my marriage, my very being, in a nutshell. The beauty of what once was slowly decaying into something barren. And maybe, just maybe, in this overgrown, neglected garden, with this young, vibrant man, there was a chance for regrowth, for something new, to bloom, even if it was something forbidden. The afternoon wore on, the sun sinking lower in the sky, casting long, lengthening shadows across the garden. We moved on to the roses, and it was then, amidst the thorny stems and wilting petals, that I made my move. I knelt beside a particularly unruly rose bush, its branches tangled and overgrown, its thorns sharp and unforgiving. "These are stubborn," I murmured, tracing a thorny branch with my finger, my voice low and breathy. "They need A firm hand. Garrett knelt beside me, his body close, so close I could feel the warmth radiating from him. Smell the faint scent of his cologne, mingled with the earthy aroma of the garden. "Let me see," he said, reaching for the pruning shears I had laid on the ground beside me. His hand brushed against mine as he picked them up, a fleeting electric touch that sent a jolt of sensation through my entire body. "Be careful," I whispered, my voice barely audible, my gaze fixed on his hands, on the strong, capable fingers, holding the shears. "The thorns are sharp." He glanced up at me, his dark eyes meeting mine, and at that moment, something shifted. The air thickened, the tension intensified, the unspoken desires surged to the surface, no longer hidden, no longer denied. In his eyes, I saw recognition, understanding, and something else, something that mirrored the forbidden longing in my own heart. He reached out, his hand brushing my cheek, his touch feather-light, yet searingly hot. "I know," he murmured, his voice husky, barely above a whisper. "Some things are worth getting pricked for." And then, before I could breathe, before I could think, before I could resist, he leaned in and kissed me. Amidst the thorny roses and wilting flowers, in the dying light of the afternoon sun, the forbidden fruit was finally tasted. His lips were soft, unexpectedly soft against the dryness of mine. The kiss was tentative at first, hesitant, like a question asked in the dark. But then, as my lips softened, as I leaned into him, as the forbidden thrill surged through me, the kiss deepened, became more insistent, more demanding, more consuming. It was a kiss born of desperation, of loneliness, of forbidden desire. A kiss that tasted of rebellion, of escape, of a desperate yearning for something more, something different, something alive in the stagnant decay of my marriage. Time seemed to dissolve. The garden, the roses, the fading sunlight, all faded into the background, swallowed by the intensity of the moment. There was only the feel of his lips on mine, the warmth of his body pressed against mine, the scent of his cologne, and the earthy fragrance of the garden mingling in the air around us. My mind was a whirlwind of sensation, of guilt, of exhilaration, of fear, of a strange, desperate kind of hope. We broke apart, breathless, our eyes locked, the unspoken questions hanging heavy between us. His cheeks were flushed, his eyes, dark and wide, filled with a mixture of what? Desire? Confusion? Fear? Perhaps all of the above. I knew my face must mirror his, flushed, breathless, eyes wide with the shock and thrill of what we had just done. "Petunia," he whispered, my name a breath on his lips, a question, an accusation, a plea. I didn't answer. Couldn't answer. Words felt inadequate, useless, in the face of the raw emotion that pulsed between us. Instead, I reached out, my hand trembling, slightly, and traced the line of his jaw, my fingers lingering on the stubble on his chin, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath my touch. He closed his eyes, a shudder running through his body, and leaned into my touch, like a flower turning towards the sun. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the chirping of crickets in the twilight garden. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and husky. I shouldn't have done that," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the ground, shame clouding his eyes. "I'm sorry, Petunia, don't," I interrupted him, my voice sharper than I intended. "Don't apologize, Garrett. Not yet. Not when the taste of his kiss still lingered on my lips, not when the thrill of the forbidden still coursed through my veins, not when the desperate hope for Something, anything, still flickered within me. He looked up at me then, his eyes searching mine, confusion warring with desire in their depths. "But you're married," he said, the words a statement, an accusation, a plea for me to deny what we both knew to be true. "Yes," I said, the word heavy and bitter like ash in my mouth. "I am." And in that single word, the full weight of my betrayal, my recklessness, my desperation, crashed down on me, threatening to crush me beneath its weight. But even as the guilt gnawed at me, even as the fear tightened its grip around my heart, the forbidden thrill, the desperate hope, still flickered, refusing to be extinguished. "William," Garrett began, his voice hesitant, questioning. And just then, as if summoned by the mention of his name, we heard it. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway. William's car. He was home. Early. Unexpectedly early. My blood ran cold. Panic seized me, icy fingers clenching around my heart, squeezing the air from my lungs. William. Here. Now. In the garden. With me. With Garrett. My breath hitched in my throat. My eyes widened in terror. Everything. The forbidden kiss. The stolen moments. The desperate hope. The reckless desire. Everything was about to unravel. The fragile illusion shattered. The carefully constructed lies exposed. The consequences about to descend. And in that moment, as I heard the car door slam shut, as I heard William's footsteps approaching, heavy and deliberate across the gravel path, I knew, with chilling certainty, that my life, as I knew it, was about to end. And the garden, once overgrown with weeds, was about to be utterly, irrevocably destroyed. Thank you for listening to me. Did you like these infidelity stories? Drop a comment below if you want. Part 2. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more cheating wife stories.